Welcome to Computer Information Networks. This is a hands-on module for using network tools. Today what we're going to cover are the very basics. So what we're going to look at is how to do remote login, how to use file transfer tools such as FTP and FTP, how to use Telnet, and when we use Telnet we're just going to test out our web servers. And then we're just going to go through some basic Linux commands. This will allow you to feel more comfortable when you're using a DSL Linux server. So what is FTP? Well, FTP is a file transfer protocol, FTP. And what it allows us to do is it allows us to transfer files over TCP. Now there are actually several different ways that we can transfer files, and the way that we do them basically is by using a tool, and that tool is FTP and it's provided on Windows, or we can use the browser, and we're going to see that. Now when we use FTP, generally what happens is we're using our local username and password. In other words, when we go to a remote system, that system's going to have a username and password that we're going to use, and we'll log in. But there is also the ability to log in as an anonymous user. And when we do that, generally what we do is we supply our email address, and then we're actually allowed into that system on that server to retrieve files. When we look at FTP, what we'll see is that there's a version that gets shipped with Windows, and it's called FTP. We're going to look at that, so don't worry about it if you've never seen FTP before. And as I said before, we can actually use the browser to get there as well. And when we use the browser, all we need to do is to use the Universal Resource Locator, which has the FTP protocol in front of it, and then the FTP site. Now there are other means for FTP. For example, there is a version that is on Linux and other types of systems such as VMS, which you probably don't even know what that is anymore. But what this means is that FTP has become a universal tool. So when we use FTP, really what we need to do is we need to make sure that we understand the name of the site, and the site could be ftp.ftpplanet.com. And we also need to understand the file name. In this case, it's MP setup. And when we do that, we have to make sure that we understand the directory structure that we can retrieve that file from. So these are the basic three things that we need to know when we want to transfer a file. On Unix or Linux, what we do is we either can use SSH, which is a more secure way of communication, and we can use FTP. So what you see here is this is how we would use FTP on Unix, and as you can imagine, it's no different than Windows. Now when we do log in, what happens is we can log in as anonymous, as we said before, or use the local account. When we type FTP and we type the host name, as you see here, what will happen will be we'll end up with some kind of FTP prompt, and that's what you see down here. And once we have the FTP prompt, we can issue commands. The types of commands that we can issue are, for example, binary, which means put the transfer mode into binary mode because we're transferring a binary file, or ASCII, put the transfer mode into text mode so that we can transfer a text file. We can also get a file, so this retrieves a file called file.toRetrieve. We can also put or upload a file by using a put command, and this will allow us to upload a file to the server, and again the file we're uploading is file.toPlace. Now what you'll see here is when we're specifying the file, it has to be the exact specification. In other words, in a lot of servers this is case sensitive, so you have to be careful of that. The other thing is that we can do local commands that allow us to navigate our directory, and we can do remote commands that allow us to navigate a directory. So when we do something like a CD, and you'll see it in a minute, that means that we're navigating on that server through their directory structure. When we're doing an LCD, local CD, what we're doing is we're changing a directory on the local server. So we have to be conscious that we're actually navigating between two different directory structures, one locally and one remotely. We can also do an LS, which allows us to list files. We can do a PWD, which allows us to show the current directory. And we can quit. You'll see this a lot in all the tools. There'll be a quit that allows us to quit that command prompt. Or we can just say bye. Now we can get a group of files, and when we do this, we use mget, and then we can specify the files that we want to get. We can get a list of the available commands, and as I mentioned before, we can do a CD. And again, in a lot of implementations, if you put an L in front of this, we can do an LCD. And really what's happening here, CD means to change the directory from the server end, whereas the LCD allows us to change the directory of the local system. And of course, we can get help. When we're using FTP, what we'll see is that we log in, and when we log in, we can do a list, and this lists the contents of the folder, and again, this is on the server now. We can do a change directory, CD, and that changes directory, in this case, to tutorials. We can change directory to active edit, so you see here we're doing list, and then finally we can download a file once we find it. In this case, we're downloading a file by using a get, and the file name is edit.txt. When we're downloading a file, we'll actually see the file being downloaded and whether we got it or not. And again, as you can see, the transfer is complete here, which means we were successful. Now notice that they provide these status numbers, and these status numbers, again, we looked at HTTP before. Now when we look at FTP, what we see is that 200 is success. 226, again, it's a 200 number, so therefore that means success, and that means that the file is transferred. So when you see a 226, that means we successfully transmitted or transferred a file. We can also do the same thing on a web browser, and all we need to do is use the URL, the Universal Resource Locator, and specify the protocol to be FTP, and then the name of the FTP site that we want to go to. We hit enter, and we'll see a directory listing. When we see that directory listing, we can use the backspace to go back to the parent, and we can just click on the directory to navigate through it. So here's a good example of exactly how that might work. Notice the URL specification, FTP. We get to the FTP server. Again, we're in a web browser, and inside of here we can navigate to the different directories. Notice the directories are clearly listed. We can also download files, so all we have to do is select the file, and it works as your normal browser would work by specifying if you want to run or save that file that you're downloading. And again, the protocol that we'll be using for the download would be FTP and not HTTP. So now what I want to do is I want to break away here, and what I want to do is I want to bring up my Linux server. So I'm just going to start this server. And as I'm starting the server, what I want to show you is how you would use FTP to copy files. Now again, you've already have this Linux server because we used it already for one of our other labs. Again, the username is root. The password is OpenSense. And this will allow us to start up our server. Notice that I have an IP address, and that maps to my IP address for my virtual net. I'm just going to do IP config here, and you can see that my virtual net 1, and this is my host at 192.168.64.1. And when we go back in here, you can see that my host is 192.168.64.32, and again, this is the Linux server. Now, as mentioned before, what we want to do is we want to start up a terminal. And we're going to look at some of these commands, but ifconfig allows me to get my configuration, and I can see exactly how this thing's configured. More importantly, I can go to the DSL server, and notice that it already started the DHCP client. That's how I got my IP address. So what I want to do is I want to start up my beta FTP. Now remember, none of these servers start up automatically. So I'm going to get out. I'm going to go here. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to docs. I go to docs because I was on the top level directory, and sometimes there's restrictions with how you can place files on that root directory. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up FTP at 192.168.64.32, and I'm going to use DSL. DSL is a special user account that was created by the DSL server that allows me to use FTP, and the password is OpenSense. And I'm going to do a directory which is an ls, and you can see here that I have a couple files inside that FTP server directory, and I'm going to set my transfer mode to ASCII so that I can copy down the secret file. Then I'm going to do a get of top secret .text, and you can see that the transfer was complete. I'm going to quit out. I'm going to type top secret, and there's my top secret message. So you can see how the FTP transfer mode works. Now if I go over to my Linux server, what we'll find is that when I log in generally to this server, and I just want to move this over so you can see it better. When I do this, I do pwd. You can see that I'm in root, but the directory that I was using for FTP was not root, it was actually DSL. So where is that directory? Well, if I do a list of, at the top level, home/DSL, you can see that's where it is. So that FTP account that I was using was in a directory called DSL, which resides in a location called home, and this is where the standard user accounts are generally created and managed. So let's go back to our presentation, and what I want to do now is I want to show you about Secure Shell and PuTTY. So there is another really popular mechanism for logging in, and what we're going to see is that a number of the tools that we're using, again PuTTY and Secure Shell, allow us to remote into a Linux server or any kind of remote server that supports the protocols. So the ones we're going to look at are SSH and Telnet. Now when we look at SSH, really what we're going to do is we're going to look at a utility called PuTTY. Now the reason why we're looking at PuTTY is because PuTTY is a Windows side 2. It's available through CGWin, and what happens is it allows us to use the same capabilities that we would see on Linux. So if you're on Linux or Mac, you can use SSH. If you're on Windows, use PuTTY. And you can download this right from the CGWin website. That's located right here at www.cygwin.com. Now when we open up PuTTY, what we'll see is that we can specify the host name or an IP address. The port that SSH uses is 22. We generally never change that. But notice we can also use Telnet here. So that's important. When we find a server that we want to go to all the time, we basically save it. So these are our saved sessions. And again, I generally save the ones that I normally would go to. That way all I have to do is load it and then open it, and it's good to go. It automatically connects. So as you can see here, either I can open it or I can actually double click on it, and that will allow me to open up a PuTTY window. When I open up the window for the first time, I'm going to see the security alert that tells me that there is a service certificate. This is the fingerprint for it, and I have to accept that. So if you're security conscious, you'll actually look at that to make sure that that is there and that you're using it correctly by looking at the fingerprint and verifying that that is truly the fingerprint for the server that you want to connect to. Now that we've seen how to actually remote in, and again we looked at some of this before, what I wanted to do is I wanted to go through some basic Linux commands. The commands I wanted to go over were ls, and what this is this allows us to list files. So you can see here in this example, ls will allow me to see these files within a directory, and some of these may be directories. And I can also do an ls-a and get the hidden files. Notice that this didn't show me the files. So these dot files generally are system type configuration files, and you normally would not see those unless you use the -A switch. Now if you use ls with a -L switch, what you'll see is that there will be specific attributes for each one of the files and directories that we're looking at. Important to note is a D in front of the attribute tells us that that's a directory, and then these are the access to that file based on the owner, the group, and world. So what happens is these are read, write, and execute, as you can see down here. So we have read, write, execute, read, write, execute, read, write, execute, and you can see that the group and world do not have the ability to actually write to this file. In this case, it's a directory, because you can tell by the D, and the directory that we're specifying is temp. Whereas if we look at foo, again, we can see that that may be just a text file, and the owner can read and write to it, but everybody else only has read access. When we look at the directory listing, what we'll find is that the size is specified by the number here, and also this is the owner information, so we know who the owner is. In this case it's DSL. When we don't have any attribute, in other words the attribute is disabled, there'll be a dash. Now other commands that you might need is pwd. This will show you the directory that you're currently in, and in this case we're in home DSL. If we cd up and do a pwd, we'll be in home. So you can see how this works. We can cd back down to DSL by either saying cd DSL or specifying the complete path, and again that brings us back down. We can also change directory to a specific directory. In this case it's directory 1, and if we do a pwd, we can see where we are. So again, you can tell here that we created an additional directory called directory 1, and a pwd will list what directory we're in. We can also create directories by doing a make dir. In this case we're creating a new directory, and you can see here where this new directory, if we do a list, will show that we created this directory, and in fact it is a directory. We can then cd to that new directory, and again what we'll see by doing a pwd is our location, which is home DSL new directory, and we of course c ... will bring us back up to our home directory of DSL. We can also remove directories if we're in the home directory of DSL, which is home/DSL. We can do a remove dir of new directory, and again that will remove the directory. Now remember, will delete that directory, so you have to be very careful. Now if the directory is not empty, you'll get an error. Now you can actually force a directory to be deleted, and that means it deletes all the files within it by doing a -RF. What this is a recursive delete. And again, these are scary, so make sure that you really want to wipe these directories out before you do it. Now we talked about the CD, and we can see how it was used. This allows us to go back to the parent where we were. So now what we want to look at is recursive navigation. What this means is that I can use the /, and now I can specify multiple parent directories. So if I'm in home DSL dir 1, I can do a cd ... and that will bring me up to home DSL. If I cd back down to dir 1, and you can see here my location, I can do a cd of ... /bill, and what this has done now is it's navigated me up past my actual home directory to a new home directory of bill. So you can see here where I did multiple navigation to the parent. Now there's other commands that we might be interested in. They are ifconfig, route, and route trace. And again on Linux, what this allows us to do is get a network configuration to see how our routes are configured, and to actually use our routing information or obtain our routing information when we want to communicate with a remote server or service. Other important commands that you might use are cat, and what this does is it types out the contents of a file. Compgen is really interesting because what this allows you to do is it allows you to get a list of all the commands, and I get a request for this all the time. How do I know what commands are available on Linux? Well, you can use compgen, but I'm going to warn you there's a lot of commands there. So generally what I do is I use a compgen -c, and then again this gets all the commands, and then I pipe it to grep. Now grep is a search tool, and when I'm looking for a specific tool, I type that tool in here. In this case it's ifconfig. We're going to see one for route. And what happens is this allows me to determine if those commands are available. Now other important commands that you might need is shutdown-h, and this halts the system. Shutdown-r reboots the system. This specifies how long you want to wait before the shutdown. Generally I shut down right away, so I specify 0. So now what I want to do is I want to go and show you a little bit about these commands. So I'm going to go here, and as you can already see, I have shown you ifconfig. I can show you compgen, and again this is going to list all kinds of the tools that are available. So if I use compgen and pipe it to grep, and this time I'm just going to look for route, and what you see is that there's two route tools here. There's route and there's trace route. So that's generally how I determine how to use compgen, and then more specifically what tools are available. So the next thing we want to do then is we want to look at secure copy. Now again, secure copy generally on Linux is FTP, but on Windows we use a specific tool, and that tool is PSCP, and it's part of the PuTTY Secure Copy Client Toolkit. So when you look for PuTTY, you'll find PSCP. Now when we look at PSCP, what we'll see is that it takes a very specific format. So to receive files, what we do is we use PSCP, the options that we want, and then notice this, the username, @host, source, and then the target. And what this allows us to do is to retrieve a file using a username. In our case it's going to be root, the host is going to be an IP address, and the source is going to be the file that we want to get. Now we'll actually show you how to transfer a file up, because we've already seen how to transfer a file from the server to the client using FTP. The target is just where you want that file to go. So here's a good example of how it might work. In this case, what we want to do is we want to copy the file etc host from the server example.com, and we want to store it in a temp directory and call it example host hex. So you can see here where we do PSCP, the name we're using is Fred, the server is example.com, : this is exactly where that file is located, and then finally we store it here. We can also send files, and again this will be the example that we use, and what we're going to do here is we're going to use PSCP options source, and this is the source that we want. We can have multiple sources. These are the files that we want to send up, and then this is the username we're going to use for the login. This is the host IP address or name, and finally the target is the name that we want to copy it to. So you can see here in this example, to do the copy for the local file of c:documents foo.txt, using example.com, user Fred, and placing it in temp foo, we would have PSCP documents foo.txt, this is where the source is, using Fred as the username to log into. The server name is example.com, and the stored location will be in temp, and the file name will be foo. When we're done, foo.txt will be represented in a file on Linux called foo. And one thing to note is we will be specified to provide a password, so you should be aware of that as well. And of course you can use wildcards when you're doing your copies. So in this case we're doing a copy, and what we're copying is all the files that are C files, and we're copying to a local directory called source on Windows. And you can see here we're using Fred again, we're using the FTP server of example.com, in the source directory all the files that have a extension of C. Now let's look at how this works. I'm going to go to my directory here, and I'm not sure how many text files I have here. Okay, I have a text file that's request.txt. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to do a PSCP, and I'm going to copy this request file, and I'm going to copy it to root, because root is my user that I want to copy to on the Linux server. It's located at 192.168.64.32 : dot means just use the same name. when I specify this, it says that I cannot copy that file. And the reason why I cannot copy the file is because, and again, you'll do this many times, I forgot to turn on the SSH server. So here's the SSH server. Now it's on. Now we'll be happy. So now, when I go to copy the file, it will tell me that the fingerprint is not recognized. And again, this is because this is the first time that I've done this operation. I'm not going to store the key. Generally you would, but I'm going to use PuTTY, and I want to make sure that you see it there as well. So now I'm going to specify the password of OpenSense, and it's going to transfer the file. The file did get transferred. To ensure that that's true, I'm coming back over here. I'm going to go into here and do a list of requests, and you can see that it's there. I'm now going to cat this, and all this is it's just a representation of a trap that I caught for an HTTP request. So you can see here that the file was transferred up and that I indeed did get it. So let's move on. So the next thing we want to do then is we want to look at Telnet. And when we look at Telnet, this is just basically a character-oriented terminal. And we're going to look at it in a different way, though. I'm just going to show you how it works and how I actually use it to test some web services. So the very first thing you need to know is that Telnet does not come for free. What you need to do is you need to go into your Windows features, and again, this is through your control panel. You go through control panel, program add and remove feature. You go in there, and then what you do is you select Telnet client and you turn it on. Once you do that, that will get installed on your system and Telnet will be available for you. Now this is just an example of how you might use it. I'm going to show you how to use it on a different place called starwars.com, but again, it's the same type of methodology. So let's look to see how that works. I happen to have a trace of Star Wars, and you can see here where this is the actual get message for Star Wars. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a telnet, and I'm going to go to www.starwars.com, and I have to specify port 80 because that's the HTTP port. Now when I get there, the server is connected to me. I'm going to do a get space / HTTP / 1.1 return, and then host colon space www.starwars.com, and I'm going to hit multiple carriage returns, and you can see here where it's going to return an object moved. So this basically is telling me that this is a redirection, and the redirection basically says, yeah, we don't actually host this particular web page, but we know where it's hosted. We're going to tell you that this object has been removed, and now it's up to your web browser to do another connection to where it tells me the location is. And the location is here at www.searchnet.com. And again, here's all the information. So you can see here that the object was found but redirected because it's been moved. So again, this is how I would test certain things like this. And the reason why I do it like this, again, I could do it inside of the Wireshark here, but sometimes you don't have access to Wireshark because you're just on a terminal only system, and you can use Telnet to actually debug like this. So it is kind of a nice feature to have and understand how to use. So now the last thing that I want to show you, because I just said sometimes you might be on a terminal that you may not be able to have this nice Wireshark, is I'm going to use PuTTY. And here's PuTTY. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to type in here. You can see I've already saved some of these, but I want to show you how to start first. So I'm going to go to 192.168.64.32. And again, I type it in there, and I would save that down here if I was going to use it multiple times. So right now I'm just going to hit open. This is what PuTTY looks like when it first starts up. It's going to tell me that a fingerprint that I have not accepted or cached yet is here. I'm going to look at that fingerprint, verify that that is the server I want to communicate with, and then I can log in. So I'm going to log in as root, open sense. And you can see that I'm in now. So now that I'm in, I can use all those commands that I was talking about before. And notice that this is a nice larger text, so sometimes I like to just PuTTY in so that I can then use the console. So I can use ifconfig, route, I can use ls-long, I can cat my stats, I can cd to home DSL, I can do a list of this, I can do a list long of this, I can cat the top secret file. So you can see here where all the commands that I have are available. And this concludes the module. Now again, what we've done is we walked through a number of different features. And again, this is useful for you if you're going to be in a network space, because these tools that we've seen are going to allow you to pretty much debug problems that you're facing, particularly when you don't have all the nice visual tools that we normally would on Windows and things like that. So the idea is that this will teach you how to use these tools and become more familiar with them.